G'day everyone, welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. Great to be with you again, and today and in the next session what we're going to do is tease out the story of the relationship between Australia and Israel, because a lot of people have asked me about this, and there's issues around, well, why has there been the dealings between the two countries, the interest in the region that Australia seems to have, and what is the truth about that relationship as well. I think there's a lot to be unpacked with that. And it is a very rich and long history. And there are a lot of our families that will have this connection or share these connections. So we'll have a look at that and unpack that as we go. And to kick off, I just might start with a bit of a personal background there, which I think will illustrate that broader family connection that will be out there amongst a lot of Australians. So this is actually a picture of my family in the Bega Valley, who actually founded the first light horse troop as a militia and reserve component. And this was in the years just before the First World War, of course. And they basically became the foundation for the 7th Light Horse Regiment that deployed to the Middle East and Palestine in First World War, as it was known at the time. And we'll come back to talk about that. But that tradition, that experience, that history of the First World War, which we'll talk a lot about, was also replicated in the Second World War. And these photos are of both my grandfathers. On the one side there, with the digger standing there with the two of them together. That's my grandfather on my mother's side. And on the opposite side of that is my grandfather on my father's side, who was in the 2nd, 3rd Machine Gun Battalion and ended up from the Middle East going to Java and being captured by the Japanese and serving on the Burma-Thai Railway, unfortunately, through the rest of the war. But their time in what was the Palestine Mandate at the time, named in relation to the tradition of that name associated with the Jewish presence in that land, as we've talked about in the history of Gaza. This experience really shaped a lot of the Australian relationship, most significantly in a significant period of time, which was the transition, the partition plan, and we'll talk about that, and the attitudes of the Australian government. So, and all of these tens of thousands of soldiers bringing back their stories and talking about what they saw, what they experienced. So my family experience was these stories. The stories that both of my grandfathers passed on to me and my aunts and uncles. And so, I grew up understanding a lot about that relationship and the deep roots of it. And then, of course, in my own experience, I served a lot in the Middle East. I was in Somalia for 6 months. I was in Iraq for over a year. And I had the Middle East desk in strategy group in defence as a colonel. And obviously trawling through mountains of intelligence reports and cable traffic. And so I've been kind of immersed personally myself in the Middle East for over 40 years and dealing with its issues, and in and out of all of the countries of the regions, or most of them, such as Israel itself and the Palestinian Authority, and then, of course, in the basing states that we had relationships with, the countries that we were needing to deal with, like Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar. And so, my experience is coming from a long run up. And of course, a lot of Australians had experiences like that built on these relationships that started in World War I particularly, and the famous and well-known tradition of the light horse is something that we revere greatly. And personalities such as the gentleman on the right of this picture mounted on the horse, Lieutenant Colonel Eliezer Margolin, who we'll talk about. So this actually experienced this was the beginning of that encounter, that relationship, and it happened right even before our troops entered into the Sinai and began that campaign in the region of Palestine, well before the Battle of Beersheba. In December 1914, the Australian troops that were training in Egypt encountered 12,000 Jewish refugees who'd been expelled by the Ottomans to Alexandria. And the diggers were moved by the plight of these refugees, and they would go and engage with the children and give them rides on their horses and provide what comfort they could to those refugees. And that was actually an experience that was to be built on directly, because those refugees formed the basis of the volunteers that became part of the Zion Mule Corps. And that Zion Mule Corps served on Gallipoli, literally shoulder to shoulder with the diggers of that campaign that we all commemorate and learn in detail. So those figures in the Zion Mule Corps, we had some of those who'd become leading figures in the state of Israel, like David Ben-Gurion and the president of Israel at one point. So this is an experience that began literally in the field, shoulder to shoulder, spilling blood together, and in the defence of the operations that were being conducted on Gallipoli and the furthering of the cause. So, from that experience, the British government realised that they had willing partners in these campaigns in the Middle East, and so the Jewish Legion was created, and it consisted of 3 battalions: the 38th, 39th, and 40th Royal Fusiliers. And the interesting thing about that was that those battalions would serve alongside the Australians directly and were the ones who secured the Jordanian crossings that enabled the rapid Australian advance into Damascus, where, of course, they were the first troops to enter that city, not Lawrence of Arabia in the popular film version of events. It was the Australian light horse that entered Damascus first, but those Jordan crossings were secured by these battalions that we served alongside. And, of course, very interestingly, one of the commanders of those battalions was the Lieutenant Colonel Eliezer Margolin, DSO, Distinguished Service Order, that I pointed out in that previous photograph, and here he is again. He came from a really impressive background already by this stage. He'd been at the landings in Gallipoli, he'd been wounded in Gallipoli, went on to serve on the Western Front and was wounded there as well. So at that point, he was then appointed to command the 39th Battalion of those, one of those 3 battalions of the Jewish Legion. So his very distinguished career continued in the Middle East campaign at the head of that unit. He stayed with a Jewish unit that was formed by the British in Palestine, in the Palestine Mandate, till 1921, and was honourably discharged when he returned to Australia. He died actually in 1944, and in 1949, after the creation of the State of Israel, his ashes, ceremonial sword, medals and decorations were actually returned to Israel for a military funeral in Rehovot, south of Tel Aviv. And at that funeral, as I mentioned, you had Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who'd served in his battalion as well as having been involved in the Zion Mule Corps, and they followed Eliezer Margolin's coffin in that funeral as a tribute to him. And in 1956, a memorial to Eliezer Margolin was unveiled in Rehovot. So, you have all of these aspects and stories being built into this relationship as foundational to the story. But when we come back to the campaign itself, we all have heard of the Battle of Beersheba and the famous charge of the light horse to overrun the town at a very critical moment in that campaign, pivotal moment that really transformed the ability of the forces in the 1st AIF and the British forces in the Middle East to move forward, finally, after several attempts to crack the Gaza-Beersheba line. So this is a photo of that charge, although it is really probably a recreation of that charge. But it became the moment when the British government decided to step forward on the Balfour Declaration, which you may have heard referred to in relation to the policy that was developed to create a home for the Jewish people in the Palestine area, because there was a very large community actually living there that had been present for 4 millennia. But the Balfour Declaration obviously wasn't the legal step forward. It was the League of Declarations mandate that set up the Palestine Mandate. But this is the moment when all of that became possible from the Battle of Beersheba. And in Israel, they know this very well. And we'll come back and talk about the centenary of this event in 2017. But more interestingly, this began the building on that relationship that was established first with the refugees in Alexandria, where our light horsemen started moving through the region where all of these Jewish settlements existed and had existed for some time, some of them ancient ones, but the more recent farming communities of the kibbutzim and the moshavim, etc., were very open-armed and welcoming of the Australian soldiers, were delighted and joyful at seeing them there for a start. And the official history of the Palestine campaign, written by H.S. Gullett, actually describes this relationship, this dynamic that built through that period as they moved through the area. And I'll quote from Gullett's official history, where he said that the welcome which they, as the Jewish communities, gave to the light horsemen was demonstrative and sincere. Regardless of the desultory enemy shell fire, they crowded around the Australians, shouting and laughing and crying, hailing them as true deliverers. Nor was the emotion all on their side. English was little spoken in the villages, but a common language was scarcely necessary to bring together eager Jews and lonely horsemen, there being at once an association often marked by affection. So this is the beginning of the description as that campaign unfolds. And he further describes that when the 1st and 2nd Brigades were operating around Rishon LeZion, the Jewish community there, and Wadi Hanin, the men always recalled with gratitude those pleasant Jewish settlements with their groves of large golden oranges, their supplies of wine, and their warm-hearted people. The worldwide dream of a Jewish nation established once more in Palestine, which had for nearly 2,000 years sustained their scattered race, seemed already a reality, and in their joy they showered hospitality upon the staff officers billeted in their houses and upon the troops encamped on the surrounding sandhills. So that's another direct quote from the history. And Gullett also stated that altogether the deep warmth of the experience and interaction, I quote, made those days the happiest the light horsemen had known since they landed in Egypt. Many warm friendships were founded, and as the horsemen marched out for action, the troubled Jews would follow them with their blessings and tears. So this can show you the depth of feeling that existed then. And that tradition, that understanding, that knowledge, that bond would be remembered by the young of that generation all the way through to the next experience they were to have. But that was built upon in terms of an Australian connection with the issues and causes of the Jewish people by the experience that we had through the outstanding figure of William Cooper, a very proud Yorta Yorta man, Indigenous leader of his people, who at that time in the 1930s was obviously very much occupied with all of the issues that the Indigenous people of this country had to face. We already had, the stolen generation policy coming into effect. You had dispossession, you had the desolation of communities with the diseases that were introduced into this country, and the denial of rights, the denial of status as citizens, even those who had served in the military. And that wasn't to be changed until a referendum in the 60s. But notwithstanding all of that and all of those trials and tribulations that he was going through at the moment of that time, he took the time to be concerned and interested in the plight of the Jewish people in Nazi Germany. As we recall, the Nazis came to power in 1933 in Germany, and finally we had the experience of the Evian Conference in 1938 that rejected the acceptance of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, which gave the Germans the green light basically to do what they wanted with the Jewish people of Germany. And that resulted in the famous events of Kristallnacht, where many Jews were taken away to concentration camps already at that point, although the final solution wasn't to be devised until later on, and their businesses destroyed, their synagogues and community centres burnt, people assaulted in the streets. It was a terrible time and the beginning of what we were to see escalate into the gas chambers of the later experience. So William Cooper led a demonstration to the German consulate in Melbourne on the 6th of December 1938 to protest what was going on. And as a result of that, we saw some later acknowledgement and celebration of the life of William Cooper in Israel, and I'll come back to that story. Then we go into the experience of World War II, and this was even greater, building on the relationship that had begun in the First World War. And you can see some of the activities that were going on in the Palestine Mandate at the time. Australian troops were based there for training, for R&R, and for staging into campaigns in the World War II battles that we've become familiar with. And here's this soldier in the centre photograph, because of all the warmth and love that existed between the Australian forces and the Jewish communities, donating to the Jewish National Fund in that tin. So those campaigns that I mentioned across the Western Desert, and eventually in Syria and Lebanon as well, against the Vichy regime there, involved our 3 divisions that were deployed in that campaign, the 6th, 7th and 9th Divisions. And my grandfathers were both in the 7th Division, and so we're both involved in the Lebanon-Syria invasion, but they both were based in Palestine for their R&R and their training and their staging. And the official histories, again, tell us a lot about how that relationship was evolving. So the 7th Division headquarters that I mentioned was the one that was the home formation of my grandfathers, was established in a monastery at Nazareth, or Nazareth in Hebrew, as people will remember as the birthplace of Jesus Christ. And this monastery overlooked the fertile plains, and it's described in that official history as a plain shimmering in the blue haze of the summer heat. And the men camped for several pleasant days among orange groves and gum trees. They enjoyed hospitality from the surrounding Jewish settlements, and each night the troops were flocking to the communes, as they're describing the kibbutzim, until the CO felt that it was just too good. And so a ballot system was introduced for a system of rotating leave to the kibbutzim, where the Australians would feast on poultry and farm produce and drank iced milk. And the Jewish way of life made a very favourable impression on the men the history describes. And in particular, their fine physique and comely appearance, their willingness to do their share of manual labour, their charming family life, and their softly murmured shaloms, as the quote from that history, was again something that our Australian troops really identified with, that connection with the land. Their commitment to work ethic and labouring on the land really struck a very important note, and it was helped, of course, by those eucalyptus aromas, those eucalyptus trees that were spreading out through that land, introduced from Australia. So I finish with a quote from that history, which says, "It was a wonderful relationship we had." This is Keith Norrish, one of the veterans, describing this. "We took up a collection and bought a player piano with a silver plaque and gave it to the kibbutz." So, and this is a photograph of the children from Kibbutz Tel Yosef engaging with our Australian troops. And I think this really gives me a lot of comfort, because knowing what my grandfathers went through after this, fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, getting severely wounded or suffering enormously on the Burma-Thai Railway, the fact that this period at least they enjoyed the warmth and love and hospitality of the Jewish community certainly makes me feel a lot better about what they went through. And in fact, my grandfather on my mother's side, who was suffered injury during those campaigns, was at the first convalescent depot, which was based at one of the Jewish settlements, actually, on the Jewish settlement itself. And here he is swimming in or at least floating in the Dead Sea with other soldiers and the nurses from the first convalescent depot. So this is a visual illustration of that relationship. The welfare system that the Jewish community provided was extensive and warm and wonderful, but that wasn't the end of it. Again, the Jews of as the Yeshuv, as it's called, the Jewish community in the area, who volunteered to fight alongside Australian troops. And one of those legendary people who did that was Moshe Dayan, who actually lost his eye while he was serving with the 7th Division. And a lot of local Jews were among the very first to join the newly formed SAS and served with really great distinction in that unit. because they could bring knowledge of the German language, etc., and were able to be very useful in the SAS through the rest of that campaign, and then the formation of the Jewish Brigade that went on to fight in Italy. So we have been on the same side for a long time, is another key point to make about this. Again, shoulder to shoulder, fighting in the causes that mattered to us. That experience was actually built upon in a military sense after the Second World War by the Australian regular and continuing participation in a multiple array of peacekeeping missions, and that included the UN Truce Supervision Organisation, which was the first peacekeeping mission established under the UN in 1948. And here you can see one of the Australian soldiers being given a very, very warm welcome by the Jewish community. They'd already known a lot about him and the experience from World War I and World War II, and so were delighted to see that they were going to be part of the Truce Supervision Organisation. And to this day, that mission remains in place, and a conversation with Michael Scott illustrates that continuing presence. And then UNDOF, which was the UN Disengagement Observation Force in relation to the Israeli-Syrian border following the Yom Kippur War in 1973, has had an Australian presence, and UNIFIL in 1978 was also a situation which saw Australian personnel being deployed, and UNEF in 1956, which was the UN Emergency Force, which was eventually thrown out by NASA's ambition to launch the war against Israel that he was planning in 1967 to annihilate the state. And so as the pre-signals of that, he instituted a naval blockade of Israel, which is an act of war under international law, and expelled the UNEF from the Sinai Peninsula. So when it was re-established in 1956, so that was when it was established in 1956. It was the second time round with this organisation given a different mandate, and it was UNEF 2 that was eventually expelled in 1967. But Australian presence in all these forces was then more recently amplified by the establishment of the Multinational Force of Observers, which is based in the Sinai, which was created off the back of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt that was negotiated between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin as the leaders of Egypt and Israel. So our connection to the land, to the people, has continued, because in a lot of these situations the personnel have their accommodation and leave situations related to Israel. So that military connection then sets up the atmosphere for the Australian government and the Australian community's attitudes to Israel's and the Yeshuv's intent to recreate the state of Israel, and effectively a community, as I've mentioned, has been continuously living there for 4 millennia, was finally acknowledged as having a sound case to re-establish a homeland, but that was amplified by the experience in the Holocaust and by the fact that Palestinian leadership were instrumental in cooperating and collaborating with the Holocaust, led to a lot of sympathy for the Jewish people and an intent to actually finally bring this home. And the returning soldiers really highlighted the fact that the Jewish community had supported them, and there was an alternative experience to that, which was a lot of collaboration with the Nazis on the other side of the story. So during 1947 to 48, the Arab-Israeli war broke out, where surrounding Arab nations, Arab leadership invaded Israel with the intent to destroy it and wipe it off the map and annihilate the Jews that lived there. It was a war of aggression, which by this time was a war crime defined in the Nuremberg tribunals. And there was an understanding in the world that this was, sheer and naked aggression. Those states weren't aiming at setting up a Palestinian state. They were aiming at taking chunks of the territory that the Israelis were living in for their separate states. So Syria, Jordan, Egypt, all had ambitions, Lebanon, of taking slices of the dirt. So at that time you had the Australian left very much totally backing in the Israeli people on surviving that conflict and achieving their state. And whether it was social democratic or communist parties, they all supported the state of Israel in its conflict with the Arab states and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini's local forces. So that was underlined in May 1947 when the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko expressed unqualified support for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. And a quote from Gromyko is that he said, "Past experience, especially in World War II, has shown that no nation in Western Europe was able to extend the required help to the Jewish people in defending its rights and its physical survival against the violent deeds of the Hitlerites and their allies." This is a fact, is what he is saying, but unfortunately it is impossible not to admit its truth. It explains the aspirations of the Jews to create their own state. It will be unjust if we ignore this aspiration and deny the Jewish people the right to realise it, as Gromyko said. Obviously, this had a lot of influence on the global left and communists at the time. So in Australia, that resonated as much as anywhere else, and the Australian left was universally supportive of Israel during that 1947 to 48 conflict. And this support came from three particular sources: the Communist Party of Australia, believe it or not, looking at things now, Ben Chifley's Australian Labor Party government of the time, and the left-wing Jewish Council to Combat Fascism and Anti-Semitism. And in 1945, the Victorian Communist Party leader Ralph Gibson declared the party's support for the free right of the Jews to enter their historical homeland of Palestine and the right of the Jews to found the national home they had been promised. That's a quote from Ralph Gibson. And leading communist Australian trade union leader Ernest Thornton voted in favour of a resolution at the February 1945 World Trade Union Congress in London calling for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Thornton stated that he supported the resolution because it, and I quote, faced the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Palestine. So you're talking about not just the left but the extreme left here, and that then evolved into the CPA, the Communist Party, welcoming the United Nations decision to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states in 1947, stating that they, quote, rejoice with the Jewish people in the decision of the United Nations, which opens up the possibility of a new future for the Jews in Palestine. And the Communist Party also consistently supported Israel during the 1948 war. A pamphlet written by Ralph Gibson equated the Jewish struggle in Palestine with similar anti-imperialist struggles in China, Vietnam and Greece. That was the context they saw this in, because it was the British Empire that was attempting to hang on and that had failed and resisted and opposed implementing the actual League of Nations mandate they were given, because they saw this actually as an imperial acquisition in reality. And Gibson was then to say that he stated the present war on the Jews is being waged by kings from outside the country. He attacked the British imperialists and the Arab reactionaries for their barbarous attacks on the new state of Israel, as I quote, and demanded that the Australian government immediately recognise Israel. The Communist Party of Australia newspaper, the Tribune, also published a lot of articles, numerous articles supporting Israel. It also published a letter by 10 prominent left-wing Australians, including Doris Blackburn, Brian Fitzpatrick, Leslie Halen, Nenny Palmer, defending the UN decision to partition Palestine into two states and condemning, as I quote, pro-fascist Arab leaders such as the former Mufti of Jerusalem, who had, and I quote again, actively collaborated with Hitler during the last war. The Tribune, roundly condemned what they called the Arab invasion of Palestine, initiated in collusion with Western imperialism. Certainly it was a fact that Britain was tightly involved in that, handed over weapons to them, trained, equipped and led the Arab Legion from Jordan. And they urged the international action to defend the Jewish state. And reference was made to, and I quote, British tanks, guns, armoured cars and rifles supplied to the Arabs under treaties negotiated by the British Foreign Minister Bevan, being used in fierce assaults on Jewish towns and settlements whose people seek only independence and peace. So that's another quote. from the Tribune. And at the conclusion of the war, the Tribune praised the establishment of diplomatic and cultural relations between the Soviet Union and Israel. It was the first country to step forward and do that. So the Australian left shared the CPA's pro-Israel sympathies. The prominent journalist Wilfred Burchett praised the pro-Zionist British officer Lord Wingate and equated the Jewish struggle for independence in Palestine with that of the Spanish Republicans against the common fascist enemy. Left-wing feminist Jessie Street was a passionate supporter of the campaign for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Other active members of the pro-Zionist Australian Palestine committees included the New South Wales Labor Premier William McKell, New South Wales Labor MP Carlo Lazzarini, and the ACTU President Percy James Clary. The most significant support for Israel came from the Federal Labor Party. As early as December 1943, the National ALP Conference expressed its support for, and I quote, the continued growth of the Jewish national home in Palestine by immigration and settlement. So look, that's a bit of the background to the more modern developments that we've seen in the relationship, and we'll cover off on all of those very interesting facts and dynamics in our next session. So I hope that you found this useful to put some of this in context and some of the ironies of the current situation that we're seeing play out today. So thanks for being with me, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers.